Hey, it's Max. How's everybody doing today? Appreciate everyone being here. Today's video is called What People Miss About High Yielders. And then I'm also going to compare YMAX versus Round Hill versus JP Morgan to try to prove or disprove my point. Okay, the number one thing people miss about high yielders is, yes, they have issues, but you don't have to use a very high percentage of them in your portfolio. Kind of in the same way that you love your uncle when you see him at Thanksgiving. He's a good guy, but you can only take him in small doses. I get triggered when I go on Facebook or Reddit and I see people saying these investments suck. Yeah, they do if they're the only thing in your portfolio. These people are inevitably comparing one of these high yield funds to some other fund as if the high yield fund was the only thing in your portfolio. Yes, and in that use case, these usually are not great. When people say, what about the erosion? That to me is kind of like people saying they like Kim Kardashian, but her butt's too big. Her butt being big is the entire point. If you like Kim, you better be down with her big butt. If you like high yield, you better be down with high depletion. You get a ton of depletion with any of these uber high yielders. Yield, depletion, same thing. If you watch my channel, you know there's a difference between depletion and erosion. Depletion, just as far as words go, implies something that comes back or is replenished, whereas erosion has more of a negative connotation, implying something that's never coming back. If you want to look at an ETF that's eroding and never coming back, look at UVXY. But the high yield funds don't deserve the erosion moniker, in my opinion, but they do have a lot of depletion. It's something we have to deal with, but it's something we do deal with in this video. So stick around. People also say, well, these things only go down. Well, tell that to Tesla, that recently added 50% to its NAV in a month and a half. Okay, now this isn't with dividends reinvested, and this isn't even including dividends, factoring in dividends. This is just the NAV. In late October, mid to late October, we're trading 11 high 10s. And by, November, we were trading 16. And by December, we were trading 18. I mean, that's insane. If you look here where it says D, it stands for dividend. It means they paid a dividend, and you can see where they paid the dividend. The gap between the open to close is most likely that dividend, most likely all of that dividend coming out. Well, it could also say depletion there. That's what happened. These funds deplete. They depleted, and these are 30-minute bars, and it's kind of hard to tell. It looks like it took 1, 2, 3. Looks like within 4 or 5 days they had replenished or recovered. There's lots of channels to talk about recovering the dividend. Well, here they depleted or paid a dividend again. And, it took 1, 2, 3, it looks like roughly the same amount of time to replenish. You never hear anyone's all in on covered calls in real life, any famous manager. It's not the way they're used in real life by real managers to create real wealth. Covered call strategies are used to provide income and little diversification to a portfolio by allocating a small portion of an otherwise diverse and larger portfolio. It's been reported in the media that Warren Buffett sold a lot of covered calls around the time of the great financial crisis, around $8 billion. He was worth probably 20 times that much. So even with Warren, it was maybe a 5 or 10% allocation of his otherwise well-diversified portfolio of companies. You never hear in an interview with Ray Dalio that he's all in on any one stock, one strategy, one anything. It's because he's a professional. Part of managing money professionally and not on YouTube is you diversify. Covered call strategies and other income strategies, for that matter, are for only a small portion of the portfolio. Bill Ackman is a hedge fund manager that I admire. He made a large amount of money in 2020 betting on volatility and kind of against the market. But he did it with a relatively small notional amount of his overall portfolio. I believe he would have been fine and his fund would have been fine had the market not crashed. He didn't go all in on VIX call options. He didn't have to, because options can provide leverage, and he knows how to access it. So yes, and there are fund managers that have gone all in, but it's the exception and not the rule, and it's a behavior I'm not trying to model. So considering all that, that's kind of my worldview about high yield funds and covered call strategies in general. They're one and the same. Yesterday, when I put everyone to that test, YieldMax and Curve both beat JP Morgan. So what I did is I simulated the real world environment going back a year, and then I simulate the portfolio being under stress by withdrawing 6% in monthly payments from the portfolio. That's generally about 50% more than most financial advisors recommend. Most financial advisors recommend 4%. You've heard of the 4% rule. Well, anyway, this portfolio is 50% more at stress than a typical portfolio. After these real world portfolios are put under stress, how much total return is left over? That was the question I wanted to find out. The high yield assets have to exist side by side with the rest of the portfolio, which is usually growth assets. Obviously, what I found out yesterday and what I found out many times before is investors can use smaller amounts of, say, YieldMax to get the same amount of income and diversification as it would take for a larger amount of JP Morgan, JEPI. Not that JEPI isn't a great ETF, but when you consider the effects on the overall portfolio, at least in yesterday's test, YieldMax and Curve both did better than JP Morgan. Okay, so on to today. So today's comparison is we're still going to do YieldMax, but we're going to do YieldMax against Roundhill this time. Everyone loves Roundhill. It's a great fund. So we have YMAX versus XDTE versus JEPI. Okay, and so this is just what I call a naive allocation. It's just 80-20, 80% SPY, 20% whatever the high yield fund is. And this is no payments taken out. This is how much the fund could make if no payments came out. This is the most the fund could make that year. So you see Roundhill beat the S&P. Roundhill was up 13.45. The S&P was up 13.13. JP Morgan up 11.6. YieldMax up 12.5. Something else I look at is the Sharpe ratio and the Sortino ratio. Higher's better. And I always compare it to buy and hold. The last column is just buying and holding the SPY. Well, Roundhill had a higher Sharpe and Sortino by quite a bit than just buying and holding the SPY. Here is a chart of the same thing we just showed. It shows that Roundhill made a little bit better return than the S&P, and the S&P made a little better return than YieldMax, and then YieldMax made about a better return than JP Morgan, but that's just a visual representation of it. So here's the problem. Here's what we have to do to run the test and to make it more real world. YieldMax makes too darn much money, or maybe I should say they pay out too much money, or their option strategies, the way they do it, they just pay out whatever they earn, and it's more than even you need to pay out at a 6% clip. You know, we were talking about the 4% rule and the 6% rule. Well, in theory, if you were just trying to pay out everything YieldMax earned and you did 80-20, it's looking like you could pay out well more than 6%. But anyway, we'll save that for another video. But for this video, we only want to pay out 6%. So what I'm going to have to do to equalize and normalize is I'm going to have to cut the allocation of YieldMax, which is this fund here on the left. I didn't mark this chart. I'm sorry. The middle one is Roundhill. And this is just for 2/3 of a year, but this is the yield or the portfolio income on 2/3 of a year. Roundhill's close, so we won't have to do much to it. We may have to, move its allocation around a little bit. Now, JP Morgan is nowhere close on the income we need to pay out, 6%. So we're going to have to boost that. So that's the problem. Here's the solution. I changed the allocations, and I did mark this one. Down at the bottom, you can see it says YieldMax 91.9. Okay, well, so on that one, the SPY went from 80% up to 91%. I added 11% to the SPY because YieldMax is so darn efficient at capturing upside. I only need to use 9% of it to pay what I need. Okay, now Roundhill, also very efficient. We could boost the SPY from 80 to 84, and we can cut the Roundhill from 20 to 16. Roundhill, also very efficient. JP Morgan, we had to adjust the allocation quite a bit, but we did it, and that's what we got. Okay, so here's how it ended up. Now, just visually, I wanted to show it to you. The top one is Roundhill. Second one is the benchmark, and third is YieldMax. but they all finished right together. You could see the three of them were together pretty much the whole time and finished right together. You can see that dark blue is actually YMAX. And in October, it was trailing behind quite a bit. You can see it separated from the line, but then it caught back up towards the end of the year. The line that is down there by itself is JP Morgan. You know, on the JP Morgan allocation, we had to cut the SPY quite a bit. So it wouldn't surprise me that in a big up year, it's not going to do quite as well, you know, because we had to cut the SPY to get the desired level of income. Okay, so here's the numbers of the chart I just showed you. Basically, Round Hill was up 8.64. Just selling the SPY was 8.3, the benchmark. YMAX 7.7, and JP Morgan 6.8. This is how much they were up after 8 months, and this is after paying out $5,000 a month. You know, that's pretty good. I mean, because your portfolio is still growing 6, 7, or 8%, depending on which one you're doing, and you have the income you need in retirement. So I thought this was a good test. If you look at the Sharpe and Sortino ratio, Round Hill again is winning, is beating everybody on everything. Round Hill outperformed buy and hold in all cases in this test. That's incredible. But the caveat is only over its small sample size, not even a full year. YMAX did really well also. YMAX is right up there with the benchmark and Round Hill. I'm going to say based on this test that JP Morgan people need either more than $1 million to retire, or the JP Morgan idea can't handle the 6% withdrawals. At least during this test and during this past year, it proved too much for it. It's a great ETF. It has a low expense ratio, but it may be for a different use case. We'll have more content on that later. All right, this is my latest metric. I know I have tons of metrics, but this is the last one. This is because I want just a one number that expresses how well these funds do compared to buy and hold. And that's what we have. So this is 100 is buy and hold. XDTE outperformed buy and hold. So their number's 103. All I did to get that was I took 8.57 and then I divided it by 8.32 and it came out to 102.9 or something. Then I rounded it off to the nearest number. So YMAX also did really good, made 8%, where S&P, the benchmark, made 8.32. I mean, caught 97% of the upside. There's nothing wrong with that one, I don't think. JEPI, you know, it didn't do as well. Now, the caveat is in a down market, the JEPI would have done better because a smaller allocation to growth, which is what JEPI had to do to achieve the income they needed. In a down market, the smaller allocation to growth would have actually helped. In an up market, it hurts. The thing is, we have a condition where, in the past anyway, we finish maybe 2 years out of every 3 are up. So that's that's a problem. You're fighting the trend when you're betting against it. But I'm gonna put all the funds in this high yield category to the same test, and then we're gonna make a max. It's called the max or the M squared on all of them. I have something called the max factor on my retirement simulator, and that does the same thing. It really does. The retirement simulator, there's a couple of things that it can't do that Portfolio Visualizer can do. And Portfolio Visualizer can more realistically simulate monthly withdrawals. But it's all about that sweet upside, right? These aren't your father's covered call ETFs. I've been doing this for almost 40 years, trading options off and on. In the past, covered calls capture upside. And you didn't earn that much, maybe about as much as JEPI. Folks who've been doing covered calls for years have been paying this price. To do covered calls, it's the cost of underperformance. Just from a technical option standpoint, JEPI strategy is completely capped on the upside, whereas YMAX and Round Hill have partially uncapped upside. It makes a difference, and we see it in the numbers. Here's the smoking gun. Here's the receipts. The middle column is Round Hill. Look at this word, this yellow. Round Hill caught more than 100% of the upside. It caught 101% of the upside. I bet that's due to it being uncapped at night. Round Hill has a peculiarity to the way that they manage their options, that they're not hedged at night. Well, it's working out to their favor in a good market. In any event, they're catching more than 100% of the upside, and they're insulating some of their downside. That's huge. And this gain-loss ratio kind of sums it up, 1.4. But, if you compare it to the column on the far right is just the benchmark. That's just owning the SPY and selling shares when you need to. So that gets, of course, you just own SPY. It's 100% upside, 100% downside. There's no strategy to the column on the right. Okay, the problem with the JP Morgan is, you can see it right here. It only gets 78% of the upside because it's fully capped. Not that it's not a good fund, maybe if you don't need, especially if you don't need as much money, but when put to stress, it's not behaving as well. It's only catching 78% of the upside and catching 102% of the downside. All right, then YMAX over here. Look at this, catching nearly 99% of the upside and catching 99.5% of the downside. But if you look at the gain-loss ratio, you have Round Hill 1.4. That's respectable, or that's really good. Then you have buy and hold 1.38. But YMAX is 1.37. It's just right there. The three of them are right together. And then there's a pretty good gap back here. When you really want to look at it, there's a pretty good gap back there to JP Morgan, unfortunately, when put under the stress of the 6% withdrawals. So this is the reason that I do the buffer report every day. We look at this on a day-by-day basis. How much upside is the fund catching versus the parent, versus the reference asset? Are they beating the parent? We talk about it all the time. What do I always say? That which ones are up the most or down the most? But I always say FEET, 5E, YMAX, YMAG, XVOL, SVOL, ALTI, GPTY, LFGY, and some others. But those are always the ones that are up the most or down the most. Well, those are the ETFs to me that possess the quality of catching extra upside. We see it every day. We see it in SONY. I really feel like the results of these studies validate my daily buffer report. These managers are breaking the metrics, Jay and Dave, Jay Pestrichelli and Dave Mazza. They've each found different ways to catch basically extra upside. The covered call spread that Jay Pestrichelli introduced the world is revolutionary. At least he brought it to the world in the shorter term options. There's some monthly option strategies that use covered call spreads too. But he brought it to YMAX, and it really helped YMAX, in my opinion. He uncapped the upside. I mean, it was the biggest thing that's happened to YMAX. But the way Dave manages his Round Hill ODTE portfolio is also amazing. They have a good plan there, and they've brought a lot of assets under management and made a lot of money for a lot of folks. Congratulations, Dave and Jay. But I'm going to say the caveats are right now, this is only based on 2/3 of a year. So Round Hill's still new. We'll definitely test it as soon as it gets to a year. In a down year, like I said earlier, the results would drastically be different, and JP Morgan would do better. Each of these three ETFs, the high yield ETFs, JEPI, YMAX, and XDTE, they each have different yields. They each have different levels of depletion that they themselves deplete. They also each have different levels of upside capture, but you really have to know how it performs as a unit. These things aren't, these things are Rodman, not Jordan. In the old days, some covered call ETFs catch very little upside. Some catch a lot of upside, All I want to know is, do these things perform like I need them to? How do they perform in a portfolio setting? This year's investors definitely benefited from a nice and bullish, but at the same time, super volatile year in the market. It was really good for covered call ETFs, probably a perfect storm for covered call ETFs. XDTE, YMAX underlines went up, but the impressive thing was that YMAX and XDTE were able to catch a lot of that sweet upside and convert it into total return. I'm going to say this year, even though there's no such thing as free money, if you've owned XDTE or even YMAX, you pretty much got free money. And the reason I'm saying that is because these ETFs In this test, at a 6% withdrawal rate, these ETFs caught more upside than JEPI. And JEPI is no slouch. In fact, it's the industry standard. And in fact, Roundhill actually outperformed the SPY, which is another industry standard. But YMAX is fairly close. The fact that they can outperform JEPI while at the same time overpaying you, paying 50%, what's considered, too much in retirement, still have a positive return for the year and still outperform, JEPI, and Roundhill, in the case of Roundhill, can even outperform buy and hold. That's amazing. I appreciate you guys being here. You have a great day.